In the year 1885, on the muddy outskirts of Brussels, a man named Henri Moreau walked out to his garden before sunrise, picked up a wheelbarrow, and began another ordinary workday. By the end of that year, the income from his small plot of land would equal what a modern family earns in 6 figures today. He had no tractor, no greenhouse heaters, no synthetic fertilizer, no irrigation system, no refrigerated truck waiting at the gate. He had a spade, a rake, a wheelbarrow, and roughly 1 1/3 acres of hand-tended soil. Stop and picture that for a moment. A piece of land smaller than a city block, a man in wool trousers and leather boots, and an income that would make most modern farmers with hundreds of acres weep with envy. How is that possible? How does one man, with tools your grandfather would recognize, out-earn an industrial operation 50 times his size? And here is the stranger question, the one that has haunted a small circle of researchers for decades. If this system worked so well, where did it go? Why has almost no one alive today ever heard of it? The answer will change the way you look at the patch of ground behind your house. Henri Moreau was not a genius. He was not unusually gifted. He was one of thousands of gardeners in a belt of small farms that ringed the cities of Belgium and northern France in the 1800s. They were called the hofbouwers, which in Old Flemish simply means the garden builders. And on plots most modern homeowners would dismiss as too small to bother with, they produced yields per square foot that today's mechanized farms, with all their chemistry and horsepower, still cannot match. Let that sit. Yields per square foot that modern equipment cannot match. Grown in a cold, gray, northern climate, where winter arrives in October and refuses to leave until April. And yet these gardeners produced fresh lettuce in February, strawberries in March, melons in May. Their soil was so biologically alive that in the dead of winter, if you plunged your hand into a freshly turned bed, you would feel warmth rising out of it. The ground itself was generating heat. I want you to hold that image, because it is the key to everything that follows. Soil that is warm in winter. Soil that feeds itself. Soil that, year after year, gets better instead of worse. And then, within the space of a single human lifetime, this entire system vanished. Not because it failed, not because the soil gave out, not because the gardeners went bankrupt or the customers stopped buying. It vanished because something cheaper and more scalable arrived, and the knowledge of how to do what Henri Moreau did was quietly folded up, set on a shelf, and forgotten by almost everyone. Here is what I am going to give you by the end of this video. You will understand exactly how the Belgian and Flemish market gardeners turned plots of land smaller than a tennis court into engines of steady, year-round income. You will understand the 4 simple principles that made it work, and you will walk away with a practical plan to rebuild this system yourself on as little as 1/5 of an acre, starting in the next growing season. No tractor, no loan, no degree in agriculture, just a handful of tools and a willingness to think differently about dirt. To understand why this system even existed, you have to understand the world it was born into. In the late 1800s, there was no refrigeration. None. If you wanted fresh vegetables in a city, someone had to pick them that morning and carry them to your kitchen before they wilted. That meant the food supply could not come from 500 miles away. It had to come from the edge of town. So around every major European city, a belt of small gardens appeared. Not farms in the way we picture farms today, with wide fields and distant horizons. These were tight, dense, intensely worked plots, each one maybe an acre or 2, packed shoulder to shoulder like houses on a street. The gardeners living on them were not trying to feed a continent, they were trying to feed the neighborhood. And because land near a city was expensive, they had to solve a very specific puzzle. How do you squeeze the absolute maximum amount of food out of the absolute minimum amount of ground? They were not optimizing for convenience. They were not optimizing for easy machine work. They were optimizing for output per square foot. And the methods they developed to win that puzzle are almost the opposite of everything modern agriculture teaches. There are 4 pieces to their system, and I want to preview them now so you know where we are going. First, deep soil preparation, worked not 6 inches down, but 24. Second, constant succession planting, where a bed is never, ever allowed to sit empty. Third, season extension using glass and the natural heat of composting manure, which let them grow and sell when no one else could. And fourth, direct-to-market selling, cutting out every middleman between the garden gate and the dinner plate. 4 pieces, simple on paper, ruthless in combination. And then came the villain of our story. In the early 1900s, the diesel tractor arrived. Synthetic fertilizer followed close behind. And with them came a quiet but total shift in what agriculture was measuring. The question stopped being, how much food can we grow on this square foot? And became, how much food can one worker grow in 1 hour? The answer with a tractor was a lot. The answer with a wheelbarrow was less. The Hofbauers were not beaten. They were simply made to look slow. The knowledge sat buried for almost 80 years, until a quiet American researcher named Elliot Coleman found the old Belgian farming records in the 1980s, read them with growing disbelief, and tested them himself. What he confirmed was astonishing. 4 times the food of conventional rows. Soil that improved every single year. The system had not failed. We had simply stopped listening. Let's open the toolbox and look at what Henri Moreau actually knew. Because once you see these 4 pillars side by side, you start to understand why his 1 1/3 acres could out-earn a modern 100-acre operation. The pieces are so simple that when Elliot Coleman first described them to American farmers in the 1980s, many of them laughed, and then they tried it. The first pillar is narrow beds and no compaction. Think about the fields you have seen from a car window. Long, wide rows stretching to the horizon, with tractor tire tracks running between them. Those rows exist for one reason, and it has nothing to do with plants. They exist because a draft horse is a certain width, and a tractor is a certain width. And the rows were sized to let the machine pass through without crushing the crop. The plant was never consulted. The Hofbauers threw that design out the window. They did not own horses. They did not own tractors. They had arms. And so they built their beds around the reach of a human arm, which is roughly 2 feet. A Flemish bed is 30 to 48 inches wide, never more. You can reach the center from either side without ever setting foot on the soil. And here is the quiet revolution hidden in that choice. The ground in the bed never gets stepped on. Not once. Not ever. Why does that matter? Because soil is not just dirt. Soil is a living structure, full of tiny channels and pockets of air where roots breathe and water moves and microscopic life does its work. When you walk on soil, you collapse those channels. You turn a living sponge into a dead brick. A plant trying to grow in compacted soil is like a person trying to breathe with a hand over their mouth. The Hofbauers understood this in their bones. Their soil stayed loose, airy, and alive year after year because nothing heavier than a sparrow ever touched it. The second pillar is deep preparation through double digging. A modern gardener turns over the top 6 inches of soil with a shovel and calls it done. The Hofbauers worked their ground to a depth of 24 inches, 4 times deeper. And they did it in a very particular way. You dig a trench 1 spade deep along one end of the bed. You set that topsoil aside in a wheelbarrow. Then you reach into the trench with a fork and loosen the subsoil beneath it, without turning it over, without mixing it. Then you dig the next trench, and the soil from that second trench fills the first, mixed with compost as it goes. You work your way down the bed like a wave. When you finish, you have a bed with 24 inches of loose, enriched, oxygenated ground beneath it. The Hofbauers had a word for what this felt like. They called it a sponge. Push a finger in, and it goes down to the knuckle with almost no resistance. Roots love this. Roots dive. They go deep instead of spreading sideways in a shallow pancake the way they do in hard ground. And a root that goes deep finds its own water, finds its own minerals, and does not panic during a dry week. The payoff is something you have to see to believe. A carrot that takes 90 days to mature in ordinary ground will mature in 60 days in a properly prepared Flemish bed, 1/3 faster, on the same seed, in the same climate. That single fact, multiplied across every crop in the garden, is the beginning of the economic magic. The third pillar is high-density hexagonal planting. Walk into a conventional vegetable garden and look at the ground. You will see rows of plants with bare dirt between them. That bare dirt is doing nothing. It is not growing food. It is not making money. It is just sitting there, evaporating water and sprouting weeds. In the Flemish system, that empty space is treated as a crime. The Hofbauers planted in offset rows so that every plant sat in the middle of a triangle formed by its neighbors. Picture a honeycomb. Each cell touches 6 others. When the plants grow to full size, their leaves just barely kiss. The ground beneath them is completely shaded. No sunlight reaches the soil, which means no weeds can germinate. Water does not evaporate because there is a living canopy holding it in. And the bed fits 30 to 50% more plants than a row layout on the same square footage. More plants, less weeding, less watering. The plants themselves are doing the work of mulching the soil. The fourth pillar is succession planting, and this is the engine of the entire income model. The rule of the Hofbauers was absolute. A bed is never empty. The moment one crop is harvested, another goes in. Not next week, not when the gardener gets around to it. That same day, often within the same hour. A bed of early radishes finishes in April, and by that afternoon it is planted with lettuce. The lettuce finishes in June, and by evening it holds bush beans. The beans finish in August, and overnight the bed is carrying turnips and spinach for fall. 100 square feet of ground, 5 or 6 crops across a single year, each one paid for, each one sold. Compare that to a conventional garden, where a bed holds 1 crop of tomatoes from May to September and then sits bare until spring. Same land cost, same soil, same water. 1 crop versus 6. 4 times the output, at minimum, sometimes more. And now the hidden 5th element, the thing that made all 4 pillars possible in the first place, the soil itself. The Brussels gardeners had a resource we do not think about anymore. The city ran on horses. Thousands of horses pulling carts, carriages, cabs. Those horses produced mountains of manure, and the gardeners gathered it, piled it, and let it compost in enormous heaps at the edge of their plots. A compost pile, when it is built correctly, does something remarkable. Its internal temperature climbs to 120, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It generates heat, real heat. Enough heat to melt snow off the top of the pile in January. The Hofbauers learned to use that heat. They built wooden frames topped with sheets of glass, filled them with hot composting manure, covered the manure with a layer of soil, and planted lettuce and radishes in the middle of winter. While the rest of the country was buying wilted imports, they were carrying baskets of crisp greens to the Brussels market in February, where a head of lettuce sold for what a laborer earned in a day. You do not have a stable full of horses, but you can build 3 good compost bins. The principle has not changed in 140 years. So here is the question that should be bothering you by now. If this system worked so well, If the yields were that high, if the soil got better every year, if a man with a wheelbarrow could earn what a modern family earns in 6 figures, then why is it gone? Why did your grandfather not teach it to your father? Why is it not in the agriculture textbooks? Why does every farm you drive past look nothing like what Henri Moreau did? The answer is not what you would expect. The Flemish intensive system was not proven wrong. It was not disproven by research. It was not killed by a plant disease, or a bad winter, or a collapse in demand. It was abandoned for reasons that had almost nothing to do with whether it worked. It was abandoned because it pointed the wrong direction. In the early 1900s, a new idea took hold of agriculture, and it took hold quickly. The idea was scale. Feed continents. Feed armies. Feed cities of 10 million people 1,000 miles from the nearest farm. That kind of food system cannot be built on narrow beds tended by hand. It requires machines. Machines require wide rows. Wide rows require fields measured in hundreds of acres. Hundreds of acres cannot be fed by compost piles, so they require synthetic nitrogen shipped in bags. The plants in those wide rows cannot shade out weeds, so they require herbicides. The soil, stripped of its biology and compacted by tractor wheels, cannot hold water, so it requires irrigation piped in from rivers. Every single one of those choices makes sense if your goal is to feed a continent. And every single one of those choices makes the Flemish system look quaint, slow, and inefficient. But watch what happens when you flip the question. If your goal is not to feed a continent, but to earn a real living from the piece of ground behind your house, the logic inverts completely. Suddenly, the tractor is not an asset, it is a cost. The synthetic nitrogen is not a tool, it is a dependency. The 100-acre field is not an opportunity, it is a prison with a mortgage. And the hand-tended bed, dismissed as primitive, becomes the most financially efficient piece of ground on the property. Let me show you what I mean with a single number. A pound of lettuce grown on an industrial farm in California, shipped to a supermarket in your city, and sold in a plastic clamshell earns the farmer who grew it roughly 15 cents. 15 cents. The rest of the price you pay at the register is absorbed by packaging, refrigerated trucking, distribution warehouses, supermarket markup, and the slow bleeding of profit through every link in a very long chain. Now take the same pound of lettuce, grow it in a Flemish bed, harvest it at 6 in the morning, carry it to a farmer's market by 9. A head of fresh, variety-specific, same-day harvested lettuce at that market sells for $2 to $4. Same plant, same seed, same soil, more or less, but a completely different financial reality because all the middlemen have been cut out. That ratio, 15 cents against $2 to $4, is not a small difference. It is a factor of 15 to 30, and it is the reason a Hofbauer on 1 1/3 acres could out-earn a modern farmer on 100. The modern farmer is at the bottom of a long chain, keeping a sliver. The Hofbauer was the entire chain, keeping all of it. Here is the thesis of this entire video, and I want you to read it slowly. The Flemish intensive system was not replaced because it failed the farmer. It was replaced because it was incompatible with a food system designed to make farmers dependent on input companies, shipping companies, and retail chains. A gardener who produces their own compost, saves their own seeds, sells directly to their neighbors, and owes nothing to anyone is not a profitable customer for any of those industries. A farmer who buys fertilizer every spring, buys seed every spring, buys fuel every week, and sells into a market where the price is set by someone else is a much more useful piece of the machine. The knowledge was not lost by accident. It was simply not useful to the people writing the new rules. I want you to sit with what that means, because it reframes the project entirely. Rebuilding this system on your own land is not a hobby. It is not a quaint throwback. It is not nostalgia for a simpler time. It is an act of financial intelligence. It is the quiet reclaiming of something that was taken, not by force, but by distraction. Every bed you build is a piece of ground that does not need a bag of synthetic fertilizer. Every compost pile you turn is a ton of fertility you do not have to buy. Every seed you save is a seed you do not have to order. Every customer you sell to directly is a middleman you do not have to feed. The system compounds in your favor year after year, in exactly the same way it compounded against Henri Moreau's industrial competitors when they mistook him for a peasant. And here is the part that almost no one talks about. The industrial food system was built on assumptions that are quietly beginning to crack. Cheap diesel was an assumption. Cheap synthetic nitrogen, made from natural gas, was an assumption. Refrigerated shipping that spans continents on thin margins was an assumption. A working population willing to eat food that has traveled 2,000 miles and sat in a warehouse for 3 weeks was an assumption. Every one of those assumptions is weaker today than it was 20 years ago, and the weaknesses are visible in the price of groceries in your own kitchen. The Hofbauer model does not depend on any of those assumptions. It runs on sunlight, rain, compost, and human attention. Those inputs are not going anywhere. They cost what they have always cost, which is very close to nothing. Paid mostly in labor and care. This is why a small but growing number of people, quietly, in places you have never heard of, are rebuilding exactly what Henri Moreau did. Not because they read a book about it. Because they ran the numbers on their own lives and realized the old system was never actually beaten. It was just asleep. And the ground behind your house, the patch of grass you mow every Saturday, the corner of the yard where nothing much happens, is waiting for someone to wake it up. Now we get to the part that matters. You understand the history. You understand the principles. You understand why it was buried. The question left is the only one that counts. How do you actually do this? Starting this spring, on the piece of ground you already own. Let me demolish the first excuse before it forms in your head. You do not need capital. You do not need a loan. You do not need an inheritance. The startup cost for a complete Flemish-style market garden on 1/5 of an acre is between $500 and $800. That is less than most people spend on a single weekend trip. Here is the full inventory. Land. 1/5 of an acre is roughly the size of a typical suburban backyard. If you have that, you have enough. If you have half that, you still have enough to start. The Hofbauers were working plots this size and raising families on them. Tools. A good spade. A broad fork for loosening subsoil without turning it. A hand rake. A soil blocker for starting seedlings. A hori-hori, which is a Japanese gardening knife that does the work of 5 other tools. That is it. The whole kit, bought new, runs $150 to $300. Bought used at estate sales and garden auctions, you can cut that in half. Compost. 3 bins, rotated through the season. 1 is being filled, 1 is finishing, 1 is ready to use. The inputs are free. Kitchen scraps, yard waste, leaves in the fall, coffee grounds from a local cafe that would otherwise pay to throw them away, manure from a neighbor with horses or chickens. Every town has these materials sitting unused. You just have to ask. Seeds. Focus on high-value, short-maturity crops, salad greens of every kind, radishes, turnips, spinach, carrots, beets, bunching onions, fresh herbs, especially basil, cilantro, and parsley. Edible flowers, which sell at restaurants for prices that seem like a misprint. A full year's seed order runs $100 to $200, and if you save seed from year 2 onward, that number drops. Season extension. Cold frames built from salvaged windows. Row cover fabric, which costs almost nothing and adds 4 to 6 weeks on each end of the growing season. A simple unheated hoop house can extend your selling calendar from 6 months to 10. Total startup, all in, $500 to $800. Now let me show you the execution plan. Step 1. Lay out your beds. Mark them no wider than 4 feet, with paths of 18 inches between them. On 1/5 of an acre, you will fit between 12 and 20 production beds, depending on the shape of your lot. Do not make the beds longer than about 30 feet, because you will get tired of walking around them. Step 2. Double dig each bed, 1 time. This is the hardest weekend of the whole project. It is brutal work. You will sleep well that night. But you do it once, and then for the next 20 years you never dig that bed again. You only add compost to the surface and let the earthworms carry it down. The sponge you built in that first weekend maintains itself. Step 3. Start small. Do not, under any circumstances, plant all 20 beds in year 1. Plant 4. I am serious. 4 beds. The reason is not the growing. The reason is the market. You need to learn who your customers are, what they actually want, how much they will pay, and what sells the fastest. You need to learn the rhythm of succession planting on a small scale before you try it at full scale. Year 1 is a laboratory. Year 2, you expand to 10 beds. Year 3, you fill the garden. Step 4. Plant in succession from the first day. Stop thinking in seasons. Start thinking in weeks. Every week, seeds go into trays. Every week, seedlings go into beds. Every week, a harvest comes out. You always have the next crop waiting in the wings before the current crop is finished. This is the single biggest mental shift separating a hobby gardener from a market gardener, and it is worth more than every tool combined. Now the numbers, because this has to pay. A single 100 square foot bed, properly managed in the Flemish style, produces $300 to $600 of market value food per year. 16 beds on 1/5 of an acre produces somewhere between $4,800 and $9,600. That is real money from a backyard. But the best sales model is not the farmer's market. It is the CSA, which stands for Community Supported Agriculture. You sign up 16 families, each paying $30 a week for 22 weeks of weekly produce boxes. That is $10,560 paid to you in advance before a single seed hits the soil. Your customers have skin in the game. Your cash flow is solved. Your marketing is done for the year. And every family in your CSA becomes a walking advertisement to the next year's customers. The difference between the hobby gardener and the market gardener is not effort. It is planning. A hobby gardener asks, "What should I plant this spring?" A market gardener asks, "What will this bed produce every single week from March through November? And what seedlings do I need to have already started before this crop comes out?" It is the same hours. It is a completely different result. Now let me paint the 5-year arc, because this is not an overnight project, and I do not want to lie to you about that. Year 1, you are building. The back hurts. The beds look rough. The first harvests are small. You are learning. Year 2, you are learning. The soil is starting to respond. You have a handful of loyal customers. You are beginning to feel the rhythm. Year 3, you are producing. The beds are dialed in. The compost is stacked. The customers are returning without being asked. The income is real. Year 5, you are standing on an extraordinary piece of ground. The soil is deeper, darker, and more alive than it was the day you started. You depend on no input company. You owe nothing to any shipping chain. Your food system is in a circle you can walk around in an afternoon. Zoom out for one moment. The average family spends $10,000 to $15,000 a year on food, most of it routed through packaging, shipping, and retail markup. A working Flemish garden displaces thousands of that every year even if you sell nothing. It is a raise that does not get taxed. And there is a quieter payoff, the one the old gardeners understood in a way we have mostly forgotten. The plants respond to you. You will see it. A bed you have tended well looks different from a bed you have neglected, and the difference is visible from across the yard. The flavor of food pulled from the soil an hour ago has nothing in common with what sits under fluorescent light in a grocery aisle. You stop fighting the land. You start partnering with it. If any of this has landed with you, the small things help. A subscribe, a share with someone who has a patch of grass they do not know what to do with. It keeps this kind of work finding the people who need it. The knowledge has always been here. The ground beneath your feet is waiting. The only thing left is to start digging.